Let's bring in Jon Karl and Martha Raddatz, who were both on the scene that day. And Martha, let me begin with you. Watching you on the Capitol steps that day around the Capitol, it was eerily similar to watching you from war zones.
It sure was, George. I remember you and I talking about that day and saying it must be like Baghdad, and it certainly was. And in so many ways, more dangerous and more frightening, because what you had that day is veteran on veteran. Astonishingly, these men and women who had been in Baghdad, who had been in Afghanistan, fending off an enemy, fellow veterans who were fighting with them. And you also had that mob mentality. There is nothing more dangerous than a mob. And they were behind us all day, trying to get in this building, successfully getting in this building and taking it over for hour after hour. You know, George, I remember standing there and there was a flashbang behind me, a flashbang grenade where they were trying to clear those crowds. Obviously, they finally did, but it was hours and hours later before the National Guard arrived. And
before President Trump said anything, John, you were reporting from the White House that day, and it's important to remember that this was the end of President Trump's efforts to overturn the election, not the beginning.
George, I think the most important thing to remember today is that January 6th was not about a riot. It was not about an attack on the Capitol. That was one element of the story, but there was a much larger effort underway that was led out of the White House by President Trump. It was an effort to overturn a presidential election, to effectively overthrow a duly elected president-elect. To aim right at the heart of our democracy. The attack on the Capitol was an element of that. It wasn't even necessarily the most important element of that. And here's the really haunting thing, George, as I have gone back and looked at all of this. It came dangerously close to succeeding, that effort to overturn the election or to call into doubt Joe Biden's election victory came dangerously close to succeeding.
And John, you have been reporting ever since January 6th, including new information in your book, Betrayal, and a lot of information about what Vice President Mike Pence was going through that day.
Yeah, I noticed in my reporting for the book, George, that Mike Pence had a photographer with him as he fled the Senate chamber, as he was removed by the Secret Service and the rioters came into the building. He had a photographer with him. And after months of work, I got a chance to look at those photos. They have never been made public, but it's a window into what happened to Mike Pence. At the very beginning, one of the most chilling images is he is brought to a room behind the Senate chamber, and you can see Karen Pence, his wife, the second lady, closing the curtains to the windows that were looking out at the rioters, clearly afraid that if she could see them, they could see the vice president, worried about his safety. And he was removed, George, to a basement loading dock, essentially a parking garage in the Capitol complex, because unlike the other congressional leaders, he refused to leave. He would not follow the Secret Service orders to leave the complex. He wanted to be here until the counting of the electoral votes was done. And of course, they eventually all came back and did it that evening.
Later that evening. And Martha, finally, you went back recently and retraced the rioters' steps in the Capitol.
George, I hadn't really been up inside the Capitol since last January 6th, so I wanted to go through the building. I wanted to see all those doors where the mobs had entered, one of them just behind me, of course, several just behind me. And I also wanted to see what those police officers were seeing and feeling. And they could really see what I'm looking at now, looking out across the National Mall, looking at the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial. That's what they saw as that mob of thousands approached. It reminded me in many ways of going back inside the Pentagon after 9/11. Of course, a much, much greater loss of life, but there is still a stain on this building, and it's something the people who work here will never forget. George.
Martha Raddatz, Jon Karl, thanks very much.
Well, hey there, GMA fans. Robin Roberts here. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Lots of great stuff here. So go on, click the subscribe button right over here to get more of awesome videos and content from GMA every day, anytime. We thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the morning on GMA.